Hey there, thank you for joining me again in our confirmation class. This is lesson 4, part 2. So, in lessons 2 and 3, we looked at what are known as the inward spiritual disciplines. They are primarily addressing and changing inward realities. The next two lessons, this lesson, lesson 4, and lesson 5, will cover what are known as the outward disciplines. And they begin by shifting outward circumstances, and through the shift in outward circumstances, they will shift our inward life. And the first two are the disciplines of simplicity and solitude. Simplicity, is, in all outward disciplines, simplicity will make this clear, but all outward disciplines will also impact our inward life. It's just that they will kind of begin with outward things. And when we hear about the discipline of simplicity, a lot of us are going to think about Marie Kondo, kind of getting rid of a whole bunch of stuff, paring down the things that you have. And that's an important part of simplicity. But the discipline of simplicity, according to Richard Foster, begins an inward focus and unity. It means to live out of what Thomas Kelly calls the divine center. So simplicity is a lot more to do than just getting rid of stuff. The discipline of simplicity will enter all aspects of life, and we'll see this when we're looking at some of the rules for simplicity. But it certainly has to do with stuff, and it's easy in our day to cordon off our possessions and our money as, well, this is not really the area that the church touches. But that all has to be under God's control. All aspects of our life have to be under God's control. And the discipline of simplicity will especially touch money, finances, possessions, economic status. That's going to be hit big by the discipline of simplicity. Richard Foster makes it very clear. It's not an either or thing. It's not like simplicity says either you are a multimillionaire with 50 jets and 3 mansions and 50 of the nicest sports cars around, or you are giving up all possessions whatsoever. That misses the point of the discipline of simplicity. Richard Foster says the central point for the discipline of simplicity is to seek the kingdom of God and the righteousness of his kingdom first, and then everything necessary will come in its proper order. That's what we're trying to do. We are trying to organize our life in such a way that we seek God's kingdom first and the righteousness of God first, and allow everything else to fall into place. And for a lot of us, that means moving possessions and items, maybe money itself, into a different part of our life, possibly out of it altogether. So Richard Foster names 3 attitudes of simplicity. These 3 attitudes will characterize us the more we're practicing the discipline of simplicity. The first one is to receive our things as gifts from God. We recognize that they aren't really ours to possess. They don't originate with us. It doesn't matter that you built it. It doesn't matter that you paid the money for it. It is a gift from God. And viewing everything you have not as something earned, but as a gift that God has given. The second attitude is to know that it is God's business to care for what we have. I would almost say it's God's business to know and to care about what we have and to care for what we have. So it is God's business to get involved in our finances, to get involved in our possessions, to get involved in every nook and cranny of our life. That is part of God's business. But the discipline of simplicity will also teach us to trust that God will take care of it. God will care for us. We don't need to stockpile our life against God's care but to trust that God will be able to take care of us. And the third attitude of simplicity is to have our goods available to others. Be willing to give things away. That is a very important part of it. I think in some ways that's where you might know that simplicity has really begun to bear fruit, is if you give something to someone else and it doesn't come back, how you react in that circumstance will mark out how far you've come in the discipline of simplicity. Now, there are several rules. I believe there are 10 rules for simplicity. We'll try to run through these pretty quickly. Buy things for usefulness rather than status. There are things we get that doesn't really make any difference, but you got, that top, highest, best model, the newest thing versus maybe an older, cheaper one. But sometimes we buy things not for their usefulness, but just because of status. And simplicity says, nope, you buy it because it's useful. You buy it because it helps. You reject anything that produces an addiction. That one is huge. It could be money. You might have to set such extreme rules around your money that you, for all intents and purposes, reject it because it is easy to get addicted by money or coffee, caffeine, alcohol, tobacco. It could be rejecting books, as amazing as they are. I absolutely love books, but if you become addicted to it, you're going to reject it. Develop a habit of giving things away. Again, that's going back to those attitudes. It's such a key one that you are used to giving things away, just letting things go from your control. Refuse to accept the propaganda of gadgets. Commercials always say you need the nicest, best, this will help you in this area of your life, and so many of those are just making things up so that you think you need something that you don't. Really take the time to learn about the gadgets before you just accept what's said about them. Learn to enjoy things without owning them. In our world, that is like giving up control. And in some sense, Richard Foster's asking us to do just that. Maybe we need to give up control and have to ask to borrow things from people because that will help those things from owning us. Excuse me. Richard Foster then writes, develop an appreciation for creation. Fall in love with the outdoors again. It's really easy for us, the further away from creation and nature we get, to forget just how dependent we really are on creation. The further away from creation we get, the less we see things as God's gifts to us. So developing an appreciation for creation will help us see things as gifts from God. Look with skepticism at buy now, pay later, because honestly, all you're doing is paying way more for something than you should. You never actually buy it and pay it later. You buy it and you pay for it over and over again. Obey Jesus' instruction for plain, honest speech. This is where simplicity can break away from just possessions into other areas of your life. Our speech should be simple. We shouldn't have to complicate our speech with a large number of words. Reject anything that breeds the oppression of others. As much as some things that we can own are super helpful and nice, if they come about by putting other people down, that should be rejected because people are always more important than objects. And finally, shun anything that distracts you from seeking God's kingdom first. That is the center point of the discipline of simplicity. So if anything is going to distract you from God's kingdom, you shun it. You put it away. You say, I will have nothing to do with it. Now we move on to the discipline of solitude. And with the discipline of solitude, it's really easy to think that all of a sudden, like, for us to practice solitude, we're just always completely alone. And that's not what it is. Solitude, it's actually opening us up to experience relationships even better. Richard Foster notes, Jesus calls us from loneliness to solitude. Loneliness is inner emptiness. Solitude is inner fulfillment. We're not called to being alone all the time. We are actually trying to address the loneliness in our life that we often will cover up with a whole bunch of relationships. But solitude gives us a fulfillment where we can be with people and love other people for their own sake instead of for our sake. Like all of the outward disciplines, solitude will be both inward and outward. And Richard Foster notes solitude and silence are intertwined. So when we're talking about solitude, we are also talking about silence. Solitude and silence, they both are inward and outward. We can talk about outwardly finding periods of solitude and outwardly finding moments of silence. And we will get into that. But all of that is to create an inner solitude and an inner silence so that we can really flourish as people, that we can flourish in our relationships. We don't need all the noise. We don't need the other people for us. We can be in a relationship with them for themselves. When you talk about silence, it's really helpful to know that our language, our speech, we use language and speech in so many ways, and sometimes it's said, our language is a thermometer. It'll give you your temperature. It'll tell you where you're at spiritually. But our speech can also be a thermostat that controls where we're at spiritually. Richard Foster says this. It's so true. By controlling our speech, we can correct our spiritual life and get it back on track. So there are some steps for us to take towards solitude. And I created a whole video over the first of these steps, which is to take advantage of little solitudes or little silences. I will put a link in the description below for you to check that video out. Taking advantage of these little moments throughout the day where you can get some silence and solitude. They're so helpful. Richard Foster also notes that it's very helpful to develop a quiet place where you can be alone and silent. And maybe it's a small space wherever you're at, but there are people who will spend hundreds of thousands of dollars adding things into their house. Why not spend some money to add a quiet space to your living area? Another way, especially of practicing silence, and this is also a way of practicing simplicity, is to do something and don't explain yourself. We talked about using more plain speech. Use fewer words, but those words should be more important. One way to practice silence is to try a day of silence. It will be hard, but it can be revolutionary. A very helpful thing to do is to spend 3 or 4 hours periodically reviewing life goals. And you're going to want to get alone. You're going to want to spend time in silence to do that. But it'll really help you see where you're at spiritually. And then the final step towards solitude. A moment where maybe, you kind of find this crowning moment of solitude and silence. You will be able to say these words of Thomas Merton. Solitude and silence teach me to love my brothers for what they are, not for what they say. So that is the discipline of solitude and silence. I would encourage you to try to practice some of these through the weeks ahead. Thank you again for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you in our next lesson. God bless you.